Official history claims that in September 9 AD, the Roman Empire suffered its most humiliating defeat of its entire existence, losing 3 elite legions in the dark depths of the Teutoburg forest. History textbooks dryly inform us that the proconsul Publius Quinctilius Varus was betrayed by his confidant Arminius and led into a deadly trap, where the Germanic Cherusci tribes slaughtered 20,000 of Rome's best soldiers. We are told that the rains had washed away the soil, that the Romans were unable to hold their lines, and that the barbarians, taking advantage of their knowledge of the terrain, destroyed the invaders for 3 days, until Varus himself, in despair, fell upon his sword. This version suited everyone for 2,000 years, because it told a clear story about human betrayal, military tactics, and the struggle for freedom that is so convenient for textbooks. But the archives lie, and the evidence that has been uncovered suggests that the truth was deliberately excised from imperial records on the personal orders of Emperor Augustus, who preferred to acknowledge military defeat rather than acknowledge the existence of what truly dwelt in the German forests. The official reports sent to Rome shamefully omitted the nature of the wounds of the fallen soldiers, whose bones were found by archaeologists centuries later, not chopped by swords, but shattered with monstrous force, exceeding the capabilities of any human weapon. The truth, which had been so carefully concealed, only came to light in 2004 during illegal excavations in the Kalkriese marshland, where a group of black diggers stumbled upon an object that should not have been preserved. We are talking about a unique artifact, known in the narrow circles of Vatican archivists as the lead codex of the 19th Legion, which is a stack of wax tablets, hermetically sealed in a rough lead case and filled with resin. It was this lead sarcophagus, engulfed in the oxygen-free environment of the peat bog, that allowed the fragile wax and the words scratched upon it to survive 2 millennia of decay and oblivion. When the case was opened in the sterile laboratory, the scientists detected not a musty odor, but a sharp and nauseating aroma of rancid fat, sulfur, and dried blood that had ingrained itself into the very structure of the boxwood, as if the stench of that day had been preserved along with the text. The wax on the tablets has melted in places, as if from intense heat, and deep grooves left by something incredibly sharp are clearly visible on the edges of the wooden frames, as if someone tried to tear these notes out of the author's hands at the very last moment. The author of these notes, judging by the personal stamp and the style of writing, is Lucius Caecilius Severus, primus pilus, that is, the senior centurion of the 19th Legion, a man of impeccable reputation and iron will, who marched with the Roman eagle through Pannonia and Gaul. This is not a frightened recruit who sees monsters in the shadows, nor a superstitious mercenary inclined to attribute failure to the wrath of the gods, but a seasoned veteran, accustomed to assessing threats with the cold pragmatism of a professional killer. Lucius Caecilius was a man who knew the anatomy of death better than any surgeon of his time, and it is his dry, emotionless account that makes the document the most terrifying testimony of the ancient era. We must believe him, because in his lines there is no plea for salvation or religious nonsense, but only a clear recording of the tactical situation and biological characteristics of the enemy that the legions encountered in that accursed forest. His notes begin not with a description of the German attack, but with a recording of the strange meteorological and atmospheric phenomena that preceded the column's entry into the affected area. The centurion writes in the neat, compact handwriting of a military bureaucrat, but as the text progresses, one can see how the pressure of the stylus changes, how the letters become increasingly jagged and angular, indicating increasing hand tremors and monstrous tension. This document was not intended for the general public or for posterity. It was the final report written by a man who realized that his world was collapsing under the onslaught of a force that had nothing to do with barbarian tribes or the political intrigues of Rome. Lucius describes the events of September 9th in chilling detail, noting that the legion suffered its first casualties long before the first war horn sounded, and that the enemy wore no armor, used no shields, and did not shout battle cries in German. We are accustomed to thinking that the Roman military machine was invincible in open combat. But the centurion's text opens our eyes to the fact that in the Teutoburg forest, there was no battle in the usual sense of the word. This was not a battle between two armies, but a methodical hunt by an apex predator on a herd that mistakenly believed itself to be the top of the food chain and realized its fatal mistake too late. The leaden codex of the 19th Legion puts an end to the legend of the struggle for German independence and paints before us a picture of the biological nightmare that was locked in those forests for centuries until the hubris of Rome broke the seals. Now that we know of this document's existence, we are obligated to read it, to understand the true nature of what lies hidden in the darkness of history, even if that truth makes us question the safety of our own world. In the opening lines of his report, Lucius Caecilius Severus states that the columns stretched for several miles, and the heavy supply carts became bogged down in the mud, forcing the legionaries to constantly stop and break formation. He writes that the forest around them was unnaturally dense, the trees intertwined with their crowns so tightly that even at midday there was a thick twilight below, similar to the twilight in the kingdom of the dead. The centurion notes that the local guides provided by Arminius looked less warlike than frightened, constantly glancing back into the thicket and clutching their amulets, as if they knew they were entering territory where no man should be. The entry states that the air was thick with moisture and a strange, sweetish smell of decay, which was not like the smell of a normal swamp, but rather reminiscent of the stench of an old slaughterhouse that had not been cleaned for weeks. It was this smell that became the first alarm signal for the experienced soldier, who knew what death smelled like, but had never before encountered such a concentrated aroma of threat hanging in the still air. Lucius writes that the legionaries began to complain of headaches and nausea, and the officers' horses began to show signs of uncontrollable panic, biting the bits and trying to throw off their riders, as if sensing the presence of a beast that the people could not yet see. In this grim introduction to the disaster, the centurion records that the official maps of the area proved useless, as the paths marked by scouts led nowhere or were blocked by rubble of huge trees, broken like dry branches. It didn't look like the work of human hands or axes. The trunks of the centuries-old oaks were twisted and split, as if a giant hand had twisted them into a knot, demonstrating monstrous physical strength. We read these lines and understand that 20,000 people, clad in iron and confident in their invincibility, were slowly and inexorably sinking into the stomach of a huge living organism that was preparing to digest them. Centurion Severus does not yet know what awaits them ahead, but his warrior's intuition already screams about danger, forcing him to give the order to double the guards and prepare the Pila for battle, although the enemy is still not in sight. This document, miraculously preserved in a lead cocoon, is the only true voice from the past that can destroy centuries of lies and show us the true face of the horror hidden under the mask of historical events. We open the first page smelling of wax and fear and prepare to hear the voice of a dead man who will tell us exactly how the pride of Rome died. The codex entry, dated the afternoon of September 9th, begins with a description of a grueling march that reduced the disciplined cohorts to a stretched and vulnerable snake of flesh and iron, crawling through the mud. Lucius Caecilius, with the meticulousness of a professional, describes the state of his men's equipment, noting that the leather straps that held the plates of the lorica segmentata together had swollen from the constant moisture and were beginning to chafe the legionnaires' shoulders until they developed bloody blisters. The heavy scutums, rectangular shields made of glued layers of wood, absorbed so much water that their weight almost doubled, and the soldiers were forced to drag them along the ground, violating the legion's strict regulations. The centurion mentions that the bronze helmets, usually polished to a shine, had become dull and coated with a layer of condensation, and the iron tips of the pila had begun to develop a reddish coating of rust, as if the very nature of the place had tried to devour their weapons even before the battle had begun. The road, which was marked as a solid highway on Arminius's maps, turned out to be a boggy causeway, where the soldiers' caligae, studded with iron nails, sank into the sticky clay up to their ankles, turning every step into a test of will. The text conveys the author's growing irritation as he sees his men, the finest sons of Rome, wasting their energy not on fighting the enemy, but on battling the cursed geography, which seemed alive and hostile. The legionnaires, accustomed to open spaces and clear front lines, felt themselves driven into a narrow corridor of centuries-old tree trunks and thorny bushes that clung to their cloaks and scratched their faces like hundreds of tiny claws. But the most disturbing moment in this part of the report is the description of how the column crossed an invisible boundary, after which the familiar world ceased to exist and was replaced by something ancient and alien to human understanding. Lucius records the exact time when this happened, based on the position of the sun, invisible behind the clouds, and calls this the moment when the forest ceased to be just a forest and turned into hunting grounds. Suddenly, and without any apparent reason, the wind that had been swaying the tops of the pine trees died down, and the heavy branches froze in complete stillness, as if the trees were holding their breath in anticipation of something terrible. The sounds that accompany any living forest disappeared, and there was no longer the creaking of trunks, the rustling of leaves, or the buzzing of insects that usually swarm in the damp air of marshy areas. But the most terrible thing, according to the centurion, was that the birds, whose cries had accompanied the army throughout the entire journey, fell silent. And this unnatural silence pressed on the ears more than the roar of battle. It was the effect of an acoustic vacuum, which occurs in nature only in one case, when a predator at the very top of the food chain enters the territory, and all living things instinctively freeze, trying to become invisible. The dogs, which the legionnaires used to guard the baggage train and hunt animals, were the first to sense the presence of what was hiding in the thicket, and their behavior changed abruptly from aggressive barking to panicked whining. Enormous dogs, capable of tearing a wolf apart, tucked their tails between their legs and pressed themselves against the soldiers' feet, refusing to move forward and baring their teeth into the void, where the human eye saw no threat. The officers' horses and mules, laden with tents and grain, began to wheeze and struggle in their harnesses, their eyes bloodshot with terror and foam dripping from their lips, while the drivers tried in vain to calm them with lashes. The centurion describes how the animals, driven by a primitive instinct for self-preservation, tried to break free and run back to where the world was still understandable and safe. But the narrow path and the dense formation of people did not give them a way to retreat. It was in this moment of chaos and confusion that people first smelled the very scent that Lucius Caecilius Severus singled out in his notes as a separate line, emphasizing its foreignness and intensity. At first it was a barely perceptible odor, which the legionnaires took for the smell of a decomposing animal carcass, perhaps a deer or a wild boar that had died in a nearby swamp. But as the column moved deeper into the dead zone, the smell intensified, becoming thick and tangible, enveloping the people, penetrating their lungs, and causing vomiting even in veterans accustomed to the stench of battlefields. It was a complex blend of scents, dominated by the sharp musk characteristic of large predators during the rutting season, but mingled with notes of sulfur, wet dog, and the sweet smell of old caked blood. The centurion notes with horror that this smell did not come from a single source, but seemed to permeate the earth itself, the bark of the trees, and the mist that began to rise from the ground, hiding the roots and making the forest look like a ghostly vision. The smell was so aggressive that it seemed as if the creature itself was marking its territory, warning strangers that they had crossed a line beyond which different laws of survival apply. The soldiers began to exchange nervous glances, clutching the hilts of their gladii until their knuckles turned white, because their instincts, dormant under a layer of civilization and military drill, began to scream about danger. Lucius writes that there was a static charge in the air, similar to what happens before a strong thunderstorm, when the hair on your arms stands on end and your skin feels a tingling sensation of electricity. But there were no storm clouds in the sky, only a grey shroud that weighed on the psyche and created the feeling of a closed space from which there was no escape. At this point, the centurion ordered a halt and sent scouts forward, although he understood that in such conditions the enemy would only be visible when he himself wanted to show himself. The men stood in the mud, breathing heavily, listening to the silence that rang in their ears, broken only by the heavy breathing of frightened horses and the sound of drops falling from the leaves. The diary notes that the legates and tribunes riding in the center of the column tried to save face and gave orders in calm voices, but the same fear could be seen in their eyes as in the ordinary legionaries. They understood that the Germans, no matter how savage they were, could not silence an entire forest or frighten the war dogs into catatonia with their mere presence. There was a power at work here that was older than Rome, older than the Germanic tribes, and perhaps older than humanity itself. A power that called this forest its home. The centurion ends this part of the entry by observing that the fog around them began to thicken, taking on strange shapes, and visibility dropped to a few dozen paces, cutting off the vanguard from the main forces. Now they were alone in this grey cocoon, cut off from the outside world, surrounded by an invisible enemy who was studying them, tasting their fear and choosing the moment for the first attack. The smell of musk and rot became unbearable, clogging the nostrils and causing dizziness, forcing the soldiers to cover their faces with the edges of their cloaks. But this did not help. Lucius Caecilius Severus, a man who never knew fear in the face of an enemy, confesses on a wax tablet that at that moment he felt for the first time a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. It was the cold of the grave, the cold that comes from a creature without a soul, a creature that looks upon people not as adversaries, but as food. And while they stood there, peering into the milky veil of fog, somewhere ahead, in the depths of the dead zone, the first sound was heard that destroyed the unnatural silence of the forest. The column stopped, not on the legate's orders, or because of yet another cart stuck in the swampy mud, but because the vanguard, consisting of the best scouts and velites, simply refused to take another step forward to meet what lay across the narrow forest path. Lucius Caecilius Severus, having made his way through the dense ranks of frightened soldiers to the head of the column, describes what he saw with the same cold and frightening detachment with which he usually wrote reports on the consumption of grain or the state of the barracks. In the middle of the road, partially submerged in the black swamp water, lay the carcass of a full-grown brown bear, a creature the Romans considered the king of these forests, and a worthy opponent, even for an armed man. But what lay before them no longer resembled a fearsome beast. It was a pile of bloody fur and shattered bones, transformed into a grotesque monument to absolute cruelty and incredible physical strength. The centurion notes that the animal's death had occurred quite recently, as steam was still rising from the torn flesh, mixing with the cold fog, and the blood flowing from the wounds was bright red and had not yet had time to clot. Upon initial examination, Lucius, who had extensive experience in field surgery, immediately dismissed the theory that the bear had fallen victim to German hunters or had been caught in a clever trap with stakes. The beast's hide bore no marks from spears, arrows, or cuts typical of knives and swords. Instead, the body looked as if it had been wrung out like a wet rag until the skeleton inside had turned to dust. The bear's chest, which could withstand the blow of an elk's hoof, was ripped open by one monstrous jerk, and the ribs were not severed but torn out from the spine along with pieces of muscle and tendons. In his report, Lucius pays particular attention to the nature of the injuries, trying to understand through the victim's anatomy the biological capabilities of the predator that did this in a matter of seconds. He writes that the bear's head was practically severed from its body, held on only by a flap of skin, and the powerful cervical vertebrae were bitten through with such ease as if they were dry branches and not bones as thick as an adult man's arm. The centurion inserts his finger into one of the wounds and is horrified to find that the fangs penetrate at least 4 inches deep, and the distance between the holes suggests a jaw capable of encircling a human torso. This observation makes his hand tremble, and a deep scratch remains on the wax, because he understands that no lorica segmentata, made of iron plates, will save him from a bite of such force. But the most frightening discovery was not the wounds on the bear, but the marks left on the centuries-old oak tree that stood next to the site of the massacre and, apparently, served as a support during the attack. On the rock-hard bark of the tree, nearly 8 feet from the ground, 5 deep grooves had been carved, going into the wood to the depth of a palm. Lucius describes them as perfectly parallel lines, left by claws that are harder and sharper than any steel forged in the forges of Rome. From these wounds oozed a thick tree resin, reminiscent of tree blood, and in it were lodged long, stiff, grey hairs that did not belong to any animal known to science. The centurion carefully extracted one such hair and noted its strange structure. It was thick, like wire, and hollow inside, which is more typical of polar predators, designed to retain heat in extreme cold. The sight of the torn bear and the realization that there was something in the forest capable of toying with a half-ton predator like a rag doll became the catalyst for a mass psychosis that began to spread through the ranks of the legion like wildfire. The soldiers who stood in the front ranks and witnessed this carnage with their own eyes began to retreat, breaking formation and pushing those behind. Their faces turned white and their lips silently whispered prayers to Jupiter and Mars. The discipline that had been the steel core of the Roman army began to melt under the influence of primal terror, and for the first time, the officers lost control of the situation. One of the young recruits, unable to bear the strain, threw his shield into the mud and tried to run into the thicket, shouting that they were cursed and that the gods had turned away from them. Lucius Caecilius Severus writes that he had to personally execute a panicer on the spot, plunging a gladius into his throat in order to stop the nascent desertion and bring the soldiers back to their senses through fear of the commander, which should be stronger than fear of the enemy. But even this brutal act could not completely suppress the panic. It only drove it inside, forcing people to fall silent and shrink into a ball of nerves and despair. The centurion heard veterans who had been through the hell of the Gallic Wars quietly discussing among themselves that there was no defense against such a beast, and that their armor had become useless tin cans. They looked at the darkening forest not as a battlefield, but as an open jaw awaiting its moment to close. At that moment, with the legion's morale hanging by a thread, the landscape around them changed again, as if reacting to the spilled human blood and the growing fear of thousands. The fog grew thicker, turning into a dense, milky wall in which the outlines of trees standing only 10 steps away disappeared, and the world narrowed to the size of an outstretched hand. Lucius notes with alarm in his diary that the air temperature dropped sharply, and steam came out of the soldiers' mouths, and the metal parts of their equipment became covered with frost, burning their fingers with the cold. This was unnatural for early September, even in these northern latitudes, and it was further proof that they were dealing with more than just climate anomalies. The trapped legion stood over the bear's corpse, each soldier aware that one of them would be the next victim, and that their death would be just as terrible and swift. The centurion ordered the torches lit, hoping the fire would scare the creature away, but the flames burned dimly and reluctantly, as if there wasn't enough oxygen in the air, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed alive. In these shadows, people imagined silhouettes moving with incredible speed, and hundreds of eyes flashing yellow in the darkness. Lucius concludes the tablet's inscription with words filled with dark foreboding. "We have entered the beast's house uninvited, and now the doors have slammed behind us." The transition from day to night on that fateful day of September 9th was not a natural astronomical process. It was as if someone had slammed the heavy lid of a stone sarcophagus over the heads of 20,000 living people. Lucius Caecilius Severus, writing with a trembling hand by the light of a dim oil lamp, describes the onset of darkness as a physical phenomenon with weight and density that began to press on the shoulders of the legionaries even before the sun had completely disappeared below the horizon. The thick, almost tangible fog, which had previously been lying on the ground at knee level, suddenly began to rise upward, mixing with the low leaden clouds clinging to the tops of the centuries-old pines, and formed an impenetrable dome that cut off the Legion from the outside world. This dome swallowed the last crumbs of daylight with the greed of a hungry beast, and the forest was filled with absolute primeval blackness, in which the human eye became an absolutely useless sensory organ, incapable of discerning even the outline of one's own hand raised to one's face. As darkness fell, the heavens opened up, raining down on the exhausted people streams of icy water that did not resemble ordinary autumn rain, but resembled needles of ice piercing clothing and stinging skin. Lucius records with meticulous precision how the acoustic picture of the battle changed. The sound of the rain, drumming on thousands of bronze helmets and iron shield bosses, merged into a monotonous, deafening roar that drowned out all other sounds of the forest. This white noise became the perfect ally for predators, as it masked the crunch of branches under their paws, the heavy breathing, and even the scraping of claws on tree bark, depriving the Romans of the ability to rely on hearing. The orders of the centurions and options, who were trying to reorganize the ranks into defensive squares, were drowned out by the roar of water and peals of thunder, turning the command of the army into a meaningless pantomime, where each soldier was locked in his own capsule of fear and isolation. The centurion describes the state of his men with clinical detail. The legionaries, accustomed to strict discipline and clear algorithms of action, found themselves in a situation of complete sensory deprivation, when the enemy cannot be seen, heard, or calculated. The torches that the torchbearers hastily tried to light hissed and went out under the pressure of the rain, and the few that managed to survive gave only a dim, flickering circle of light with a radius of no more than 5 steps, beyond which the abyss began. This dancing fire did more harm than good, creating strange, twitching shadows that darted across the tree trunks, forcing the tired minds of the soldiers to see monsters where there were none. The men winced at every movement of the branch, aiming their peeler into the void, their nervous systems overloaded with the constant anticipation of an attack. And this stress drained their strength faster than a multi-day march through the swamps. Lucius Caecilius notes that it was at this moment, when tension reached its peak and visibility dropped to 0, that what he calls in his report the shadow hunt began. The first contact occurred at the junction of the 3rd and 4th cohorts, at the very spot where the line was forced to break apart due to a pile of oak trees felled by the storm, creating an ideal breach for penetration. It was not like the attack of barbarians, who usually attack in an avalanche, with wild cries and the clash of weapons, in order to suppress the enemy's will with noise and fury even before the first blow. Here everything happened in absolute silence. If you don't count the sound of the rain, no arrows or darts flew out of the darkness, no people with axes jumped out. Just the darkness itself thickened for a moment and took shape, rushing towards the outermost row of legionnaires. The eyewitness account recorded by Lucius is chilling in its ordinariness and impossibility. The legionary Titus, a 10-year veteran standing on the right flank, suddenly disappeared from his position, as if he had been erased from reality with a giant eraser. The soldiers standing nearby didn't even have time to turn their heads. They only felt a sharp gust of wind that smelled of wet wool and rot, and saw how the place where their comrade had just stood became empty. There was no sound of impact, no clang of metal on metal, only the dull, wet sound of a heavy body crashing into another body at great speed, and the instantaneous lifting of a person from the ground. Titus, clad in 40 pounds of iron and leather, was torn from the line with such monstrous kinetic energy that his sandals left deep furrows in the mud, and the shield he held in his hand flew away like a toy. A second later, a scream broke the silence, but it came not from the ground level where the fight should have taken place, but from somewhere above, from the impenetrable darkness of the treetops, where the light of the torches did not reach. It was the cry of a man who had realized his death, but had not yet died. A cry full of animal horror and pain that drowned out even the noise of the downpour and made thousands of people freeze, raising their heads upward. But as suddenly as it began, the screams stopped. replaced by a sound that Lucius describes as the wet crunch of breaking reeds. Only in this case, it was not a reed that was breaking, but a human spine and ribcage. The centurion realized with horror that the creature that had attacked them had such strength and agility that it was able to drag a grown man in full armor up to 20 feet in a couple of seconds, using a tree as a ladder. And then a different kind of rain began. Heavy, warm drops, much thicker and darker than the heavenly water, began to fall on the raised shields and faces of the stunned legionnaires. In the torchlight, the soldiers saw their armor becoming stained crimson, and the smell of fresh, hot blood hit their noses, mixing with the smell of ozone and swamp rot, causing bouts of nausea. From above, out of the invisible darkness, first a bent helmet fell to the ground, on which deep punches from teeth that had pierced the bronze like paper were visible. And then the mutilated body of Titus, which collapsed into the mud like a shapeless sack. His head was twisted at an unnatural angle. His throat had been ripped out, and his lorica segmentata showed claw marks from where the steel plates had been cut as if they were fabric. This moment became the point of no return, when the iron discipline of the Roman legion, forged over centuries of drill and victories, cracked and began to crumble under the onslaught of irrational terror. The soldiers, seeing what had happened to their comrade, and realizing that the enemy was not in front of them, but above them, on a plane they could not control, succumbed to panic. The archers, obeying instinct rather than orders, began firing randomly into the treetops, shooting arrows into the darkness, hoping to hit at least something living. But the arrows only hit the tree trunks or disappeared into the foliage, causing no harm to the invisible predator that moved through the branches faster than a man could aim. Lucius Cecilius writes that chaos gripped the ranks. The legionaries began to huddle together, breaking the tortoise formation. They raised their shields over their heads, trying to protect themselves from the threat from the air. But in doing so, they opened their flanks to new attacks. The attacks followed immediately, and it became clear that it was not a lone monster operating in the forest, but an organized pack that was using the victim's panic to implement its tactics. Shouts and sounds of struggle began to be heard from different sides of the perimeter. Shadows darted between the trees, snatching people from the line, one after another, with frightening efficiency. The centurion saw only fragments of his attackers, a flicker of grey, coarse fur, the gleam of huge yellow eyes without pupils, and bared jaws full of dagger-like teeth that closed around the soldiers' limbs. The Roman weapons, designed for combat with humans, proved practically useless in this meat grinder. Heavy pila were impossible to throw in the dense forest and in the dark, and short gladii required close contact, which for a legionary meant certain death. Lucius describes an episode in which a group of 3 soldiers attempted to surround and stab one of the creatures, which had lingered for a moment on the ground, tormenting a fallen man. They struck with precision, aiming for the neck and sides, but their swords either slid across the incredibly tough hide, covered in thick, matted fur, or got stuck in the dense muscles, causing no fatal wounds. The creature reacted to the blows not with pain, but with rage. It turned with incredible speed, and with one blow of its paw, armed with claws the length of a dagger, it tore off the head of the first soldier along with his helmet. It bit the second one in half at the waist, ignoring the chainmail, and threw the third one into a tree with such force that the sound of breaking bones could be heard even through the noise of the rain. The centurion bitterly admits in his diary that at that moment he lost control of the battle. Because it was not a battle, but a slaughterhouse, where trained professionals were turned into a helpless herd that was methodically slaughtered. The screams of the dying, the roar of monsters that resembled a mixture of a wolf's howl and human laughter, the clang of metal and the crack of torn flesh merged into one monstrous symphony of destruction. The officers tried to shout commands, urging them to maintain formation, but their voices broke into shrieks, and they themselves died first, since the crests on their helmets made them visible targets for predators. Lucius saw his old friend, the primus of the 18th Legion, knocked down by a huge black shadow and torn to pieces in a matter of seconds, without even having time to draw his sword from its sheath. But the most terrifying thing, according to the author of the document, was not the death itself, but how the enemy used psychology. The creatures did not kill everyone at once. They deliberately inflicted severe, but not fatal wounds, forcing the wounded to scream and beg for help. These screams demoralized the living more than the sight of corpses, forcing soldiers to throw down their weapons and flee into the forest, where an even more terrible fate awaited them. The forest became a labyrinth of death, where behind every tree, in every bush, and on every branch, death lurked, reveling in the hunt. Those who tried to escape disappeared without a trace, their cries receding into the thicket and there breaking off, replaced by the contented purring of the pack. Lucius writes that they found themselves in a situation for which no one had prepared them. Their tactics, their formations, their belief in their own invincibility, all of this crumbled to dust when faced with a species that had evolved for millions of years with one single purpose: to kill. In the darkness, with the pouring rain pouring down on their eyes, the Romans realized that they were no longer the masters of the world. They were just meat that came to the table. The diary records a moment of utter despair when the centurion, gathering the remnants of his cohort around him, ordered a perimeter defense around a large oak tree, realizing that this would only delay the inevitable. They stood back to back, holding gladii slippery with blood in trembling hands, and listened to the ring of predators closing around them, to dozens of paws softly stepping through the mud, and to the heavy, foul breath growing ever closer. Flashes of lightning would momentarily snatch the silhouettes of the attackers from the darkness, and the sight was enough to drive one insane. The creatures stood on their hind legs, towering over people by a head, their bodies a mass of twisted muscle, covered in scars and coarse fur. Their muzzles, elongated and toothy, resembled those of wolves, but there was something grotesquely human about them, a sinister expression that expressed not only hunger, but also sadistic pleasure. They took their time, knowing their prey had nowhere to escape, and they reveled in the fear that radiated from the humans in waves. Lucius ends his description of this night with a phrase that sounds like a sentence against the entire Roman civilization. "We came here as conquerors, but we will die as fodder." And the darkness that surrounds us is not simply the absence of light, it is their element, in which we are blind and they are all-seeing. The grey, bleak dawn of September 10th brought no relief to the survivors. It merely tore away the protective veil of darkness, revealing the scale of the catastrophe and allowing the legionnaires to finally see their executioners in details that the human mind refused to accept. Lucius Caecilius Severus, whose handwriting by this point resembles the cardiogram of a dying man, describes the morning scene not as a battlefield, but as the interior of a gigantic slaughterhouse, where the ground has become a sticky mess of mud, entrails, and fragments of equipment. The rain stopped, but instead a thick steam rose from the ground, saturated with the metallic smell of blood, which was so thick that it settled as a greasy film on the lips and tongue. The surviving soldiers, huddled in tight defensive rings on small hills, looked at the forest surrounding them and saw figures emerging from the fog that forever obliterated all ancient knowledge of zoology and the limits of the possible. Now, in the light of day, the monsters no longer hid. They emerged from the shadows with the confidence of masters fully aware of their physical superiority over the pitiful figures in iron armor. The centurion describes with terrifying precision the biology of the creature standing just 20 paces from his position. It was a colossal bipedal predator, standing over 8 feet tall, making the tallest legionary look like a child. Its anatomy was a grotesque hybrid of wolf and primate, created by evolution for one single purpose: killing large mammals. The creature's body was covered with stiff, matted fur the color of wet bark, through which bulged knots of hypertrophied muscles, dense and hard as ship ropes. Lucius notes a strange disproportion. The creature's forelimbs were unnaturally long and powerful, ending in hands with a semi-protruding thumb, which allowed them not only to tear flesh, but also to grab objects or break bones with a grip. The claws, black and curved, resembled harvest sickles. Their length reached the length of a Roman pugio dagger, and they were capable, as the soldiers had already discovered, of ripping open the iron plates of a lorica segmentata with frightening ease. But the most terrifying thing was the face of this beast. An elongated, wolfish muzzle with wide nostrils that flared, inhaling the scent of fear, and a mouth studded with a double row of teeth. Centurion writes that the teeth were not just fangs, but had a saw-like edge, like those of sharks, designed for tearing out pieces of flesh and not just biting. The creature's eyes, devoid of whites and pupils, glowed with a steady amber light. There was no bestial fury in them, only the cold, calculating intellect of a sadist. The battle that followed this visual contact, Lucius calls the massacre of the innocents, emphasizing the complete technological helplessness of the Roman military machine in the face of such an enemy. The Romans, true to form, attempted to meet the attack with a volley of pilums, but the heavy darts, capable of piercing a Gaul's shield, bounced off the monster's skins or got stuck in the thick undercoat and layers of fat, not reaching vital organs. One of the creatures, having taken a spear blow straight to the chest, only growled dully, broke the shaft with its paw, and continued moving without slowing down, as if it had been hit not by battle steel, but by a dry splinter. This spectacle caused shock among the ranks of the legionnaires. They realized that their weapons, which had conquered half the world, were worth nothing here in this cursed forest. When the distance was reduced to a sword strike, the real slaughter began. The Roman tactics of a dense formation designed for a frontal clash with infantry played a cruel joke on them, turning the legionaries into a crowded mass, deprived of maneuver. The monsters crashed into the turtle formation with the kinetic energy of a battering ram, throwing 200-pound men around like ragdolls, shields cracking and breaking under the blows of their paws, and the bones of the hands that held those shields turning to crumbs. Lucius describes a scene where one of the beasts grabbed a legionary by the head and shoulder and simply pulled him in different directions. The sound of tearing flesh and cracking spines was audible even above the general roar of battle. The gladii, short stabbing swords, proved too short to reach the giants' hearts or throats, and slashing blows only left shallow cuts in their thick hide, causing the creatures to burst into rage. The centurion bitterly records the futility of fire, which was the last hope. When the soldiers tried to use burning brands and oil, the creatures were not afraid of the flames, like ordinary animals. On the contrary, the fire enraged them. They attacked the torchbearers with redoubled aggression, trampling the fires and tearing apart those who dared challenge their dominance. Lucius writes that the smell of scorched wool mingled with the stench of blood, creating an unbearable stench that made the eyes water. In the chaos of the melee, the diary's author saw a young option, his helmet gone, desperately thrust his sword into the eye of an attacking monster. It was the only successful blow that Lucius recorded. The creature roared. The sound was like metal scraping on glass, and began blindly smashing everything around it, killing both its attacker and 3 more legionnaires with its death throes, until it fell silent as a heap of meat. But this was a drop in the ocean. For every slain monster, there were hundreds of torn-apart Romans, whose bodies littered the clearing in several layers, turning the ground into a swamp of red mud. The structure of the legion had completely disintegrated. There were no more cohorts or maniples, only scattered groups of suicide bombers who fought back to back, fighting off the predators pressing in from all sides. Lucius Caecilius Severus, himself wounded in the thigh and without a shield, describes what happened as a miniature apocalypse. He saw the proud eagles of the legions, symbols of Rome's power, fall into the mud and be trampled by clawed paws. He saw veterans who had fought in dozens of campaigns weep in helplessness and terror before their throats were ripped out. In this hell of sounds and smells, the centurion noticed one detail that struck him most. The monsters acted in unison, communicating with each other in short growls and clicks. They herded people into traps, cut off groups from the main force, and methodically eliminated officers, as if they understood who was giving the orders. This wasn't the chaos of the wild. It was a planned military operation, carried out by a species that had probably been fighting since the Romans' ancestors were still living in caves. Lucius writes that in the eyes of one of the creatures that stopped in front of him, he saw not the animal nature, but the abyss of an ancient, alien mind, which looked at man not as an enemy, but as an annoying obstacle that must be eliminated. By midday, all that remained of the 3 legions were scattered pockets of resistance, fading one by one like candles in the wind. The ground was so saturated with blood that it could no longer absorb moisture, and red streams flowed into the lowlands, forming lakes of death. The monsters, having had their fill of the first blood, began to behave more calmly. They walked among the corpses, finishing off the wounded with blows from their paws or bites, without showing any haste. The centurion, realizing that the end was near, ordered the remnants of his detachment to break through to the rocky ridge to the east, hoping to find at least some shelter there, although deep down he knew that there was no salvation. The writing in this section of the Codex becomes garbled, with drops of the author's own blood visible on the wax, and the final lines describe him looking back and seeing a field strewn with the bodies of his brothers in arms, feasted upon by the demons of the Teutoburg forest. The final wax tablet from the lead codex of the 19th Legion differs from the previous ones even visually. The wax on it is not smooth, but covered with deep dents, as if the author pressed the stylus with the despair of a doomed man, and the handwriting, previously calligraphic and clear, has turned into a jagged cardiogram of agony. Lucius Caecilius Severus, the last officer of the destroyed army, writes these lines from a cramped hole in the ground beneath the roots of a storm-fallen oak tree, where he crawled like a wounded animal, trying to delay the inevitable end. He reports that his left leg is broken below the knee, and from a deep wound on his side, inflicted by the creature's claw, dark blood constantly oozes, the smell of which in the stale air of the shelter is maddening with its sweetness. Outside, behind a thin wall of tangled roots and damp earth, he hears sounds more terrible than death itself. The chomping, the crunch of bones being chewed, and the contented rumbling of the pack as it finishes its meal, devouring the bodies of his soldiers. The centurion realizes that his hiding place is not a fortress, but only a temporary respite, and that the creatures know his location with the same precision with which a hound knows where a fox is hiding when cornered. He writes not to ask for help, for he knows that help will not come, but to leave a warning to the emperor and to Rome, a warning that should become an epitaph to all imperial ambitions in the north. Lucius begs Augustus to forget about the borders along the Elbe, to forget about gold and slaves, and to build a wall so high and strong that not a single creature from this accursed forest will ever set foot on the soil of the civilized world. He describes these creatures not as demons from myths, but as perfect biological death machines, against which tactics, iron and courage are powerless, for they stand one step above man in the food chain. The text conveys a sense of mounting panic, mixed with a cold determination to fulfill his final duty. The centurion records how the sounds outside change. The chomping died down and was replaced by silence, broken only by the sound of heavy footsteps that made the ground above his head shake and loose soil fall down the back of his neck. He writes that he hears one of the creatures approach the roots of the oak tree and noisily inhale the air, searching for the exact place where the last drop of living blood in this forest is hiding. Lucius describes the sound of the monster's breathing. It is a deep, vibrating sound, like the work of a giant blacksmith's bellows, in which one can hear the wet wheezing of lungs adapted for long runs. The creature takes its time, playing with its prey, scratching the tree bark with its claws, and making quiet clicking sounds, which the author believes are a form of communication or laughter. The light filtering through the cracks between the roots begins to dim, not because of the sunset, but because a massive carcass has blocked the exit, plunging the shelter into almost complete darkness. Centurion writes that he sees through a gap in the ground the glint of a yellow eye, looking straight at him, studying it with the cold curiosity of an entomologist examining a beetle in a jar. It is a moment of absolute existential horror, a meeting of the gazes of two intelligent species, one of which dies and the other triumphs, asserting its right to the strong. Lucius clutches the Pugio, his last dagger, but he knows it is a gesture of desperation, not self-defense, since steel will do no harm to one who has killed 20,000 people. The last sentences on the tablet become incoherent. The letters jump and collide with each other, capturing the last seconds of the author's life. He hears the crack of wood being torn apart. The creature decided the game was over and began digging its hole, ripping centuries-old roots from the ground with such force as if they were rotten threads. The earth falls in a stream, filling his mouth and eyes. The light of the torch that Lucius held nearby goes out, and he is left in the darkness, alone, with the heavy breathing that now sounds very close, right above his ear. The text breaks off mid-sentence. Roma aeterne. Rome is eternal, followed by a long, deep groove that cuts through wax and wood, the mark of a claw that knocked the tablet out of the centurion's hands during the attack. In 2005, when scholars finished deciphering the lead codex, it became clear why Emperor Octavian Augustus, upon receiving news of the death of his legions, banged his head against the doorframe and shouted, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions!" It was not a cry for lost soldiers, but a fear that whatever had killed them might come for it to Rome. And that is why Germanicus's punitive expedition, sent out years later, had secret orders not to conquer, but to purge and burn. The official history, written by the victors, concealed this fact, turning a biological nightmare into a political drama, so as not to sow panic among the population of the empire, and not to admit that man has a natural enemy. The document was classified, hidden in the deepest cellars, and the site of the battle was declared cursed, where local tribes were afraid to go even centuries later, passing on legends about wolves walking on two legs from mouth to mouth. Today, the Teutoburg Forest is a tourist area and an open-air museum where families with children stroll and historical battles are reenacted. But local rangers still warn tourists not to stray from the marked trails or venture into the thicket, especially on cloudy days when fog rises from the swamps. The missing persons statistics in this region are abnormally high for civilized Europe, and most disappearances are attributed to accidents or wild boars. But we, who have read the lead code of the 19th Legion, know the truth. They did not go anywhere. They simply learned to wait and became more careful. For the forest is vast, and their hunger is eternal.